I want to talk briefly about using graphing calculators. You really should be able to check these, and you have to have good graphing calculator skills to be able to enter something this complex in your calculator. So I do want to verify that this graph is correct and graph this in a different video. But I'm going to type this into my graphing calculator. A couple things here. Number one, you need to decide if you're working in radians or degrees. And in general, I make that decision based on the phase shift. If it's in degrees, I do everything in degrees. If it's in radians, I do everything in radians. That's going to affect your mode. It's also going to affect your window. So first of all, go to your mode. We're going to be graphing in degrees. Make sure you're in degrees. My calculator is in degrees, so we're good there. Then you can go type the equation in, okay? This is part of the reason I wanted to make this video. Be very careful. The sine and cosine function force you to put parentheses right here, okay? So I'm not taking the cosine of 2 and then multiplying it by x plus 45. I'm taking the cosine of this whole thing. It's the quantity 2 times the quantity x plus 45. Then you're going to close out your parentheses. Then the minus 1 will be outside of that. So you can see here I've got the opening parentheses. I've got the starting parentheses for the x plus 45. Notice I've closed that parentheses. I closed the parentheses for the cosine. So I've got double parentheses here. And then I've got the minus 1. Okay? You also need to get your window set up appropriately. And your window is going to be kind of based on what your graph looks like. So it looks like in the x direction, I probably want to go to at least 180, maybe back to at least negative 90. And I'm going to go up to, 3 or 4 and probably down to negative 3 or negative 4. So let's go to the window and change that. You should always do this by hand because you know better what you're trying to do than your calculator does. So we can go back to like negative 90 in the x direction. Maybe at least 180 in the y direction. And you kind of want it to match what you've done by hand so you can compare the two. And again, maybe have the y go to about negative 4 and maybe about positive 4. And then if you graph it, and again, the scales will be different. So, they may not look exactly the same there. And you may want to trace a little bit too. If you hit the trace button there, you can kind of see some key points. So for example, that's the point 45.2. You can see on my graph here, 45.2 is a point. You could trace down to this point over here. But anyway, in general, the graph looks pretty good. Okay, let's try one in radians. Here's a pretty complicated one I did in radians in a different video. All right, so got to make sure your calculator's in radian modes. Let's go over here to radians and make that selection. And then you can type that equation in. It's going to be negative sine. And again, it's going to make you use parentheses. So it's negative sine 2. Then you're going to have a new quantity opening up. And you're going to have x minus pi over 4. And the way the order of operations works, you can have pi over 4 without having parentheses around the pi over 4. Though if you want to put parentheses around pi over 4, it's not going to hurt. So close out your parentheses for the x minus pi over 4. Close out your parentheses for the sine. Then you're going to have your plus 1. Okay? And then I need to set up my graph. Remember, you're going to need to change the window. We're working in radians now. Looks like here I was having it go maybe to about 2 pi radians, maybe back to about negative pi radians. And looks like it's actually counting by about pi over 4 radians each time. So you want to keep those things in mind when you put your window together. So the x, again, working in radians, I'm going to have it go back to negative pi. And I'm going to have it max out at 2 pi. And you'll notice your calculator may change that. Pi is about 3.14, 2 pi is about 6.28. So you may see that replace. The scale here, instead of counting by ones, I'd like it to count by pi over 4. And that way I can kind of match up with my graph as well. So it's going to give me the decimal equivalent there. I only need it to go up to about 3. I'm going to have it go down to negative 1 just to see a little bit below the axis, and up to 3 should be fine. And let's go ahead and graph this and let's see if it matches up with what we have here. It looks pretty good. So again, you can kind of trace and you can kind of see some key points. So for example, we've got the point pi 2 would be a pretty easy one to see there if you trace. And so let's go over here and trace. Now remember, pi will be about 3.14, so it's not dead on that point when I traced, but it's really pi. And then it's not quite at 2 because it kind of jumps when you do it. But anyway, you can see the two graphs match up pretty nicely. So again, just make sure you're in the correct mode when you graph. Make sure you're using parentheses correctly when you type the equation in, and also make sure that you set your window up to match the window that you've used for graphing if you want to be able to make a comparison.